Grab your cocktail and get ready for this episode of the Old Fashion Masonic Podcast. Welcome to the Old Fashion Masonic Podcast, where we talk all things Freemasons while drinking an old fashioned. I'm Brian, and this dashing gentleman to my right or left, depending on how Zoom wants to drop this on the screen, our brother Oscar. And look at the last name here, right? I screwed it up the first time, but I got it on the second. Brother Oscar Alleyne, the Y is silent, and so is the second E. Brother Oscar, welcome to the Old Fashion Masonic Podcast.
Thank you, Brother Byrd. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, in the background, we see that beautiful Statue of Liberty. So we're going to surmise that you may be in the Northeast somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a New Yorker, tried and true.
All right. So where you're at, some of our listeners, if you'll go back maybe 10, 12 years, you'll remember the show on maybe TLC where the father and son were building motorcycles, the Orange County choppers. You're eerily close to them, right?
Yeah, I'm about 10, 15 minutes. I'm in Orange County, New York. Most people think Orange, California, Orange, Florida, and Orange, New Jersey. But there's an Orange County, New York, which is about an hour and a half north of New York City, right west of the Hudson River. And that's home of Orange County choppers when it was still here for a bit.
Fascinating. I would say that Orange County, New York may have the tenure because, as a state, you've been around a long time. So is Orange County, New York, does that trump? Definitely Orange County, California. They're new. It'd be interesting who has the naming rights.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's going to fight for their own territories.
As they should.
Actually, in our county, we had the New Windsor Cantonment, as well as several places where George Washington was headquartered during the Revolutionary War. So it's an old area with a lot of history and et cetera. So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, history is a nice buzzword because we're going to get into that a little bit later. So as our listeners know on the Old Fashioned Masonic Podcast, we like to know as much about the man as we do the Mason. So let's push Masonry to the side, my friend, and tell us, who's Brother Oscar?
All right. So Brother Oscar is a guy from Brooklyn, New York. I am a public health official, spent about 15, 16 years as director of epidemiology of Rockland County, New York. And then from there, I actually went on to become the chief program officer for the National Association of County City Health Officials in DC for about 7 years there. And then for 3 years, I was the managing director of public health for the federally funded research and development center operated by MITRE, which is also in the DC, Virginia area. All that means to say that I am a health professional. Some may remember me from during the pandemic, being on television or even on social media, trying to provide as much current as well as decent information from a scientific and trusted source. And a brother who was in the midst and in the situation room for a few of those times, and really just trying to make sure that we, have a path forward for both our sustainability as a population and protection for our aims and health and wellness of who we are as human beings. So, I am a scientist. I am a communicator. I play sports. People do joke and say they don't think I sleep, but I do sleep. But yeah, that's me just trying to make an impact and, doing what I know my life's mission is supposed to be.
I love it. So believe it or not, we're almost at 5 years since the pandemic initially started. Isn't it crazy to think? It's crazy. Sometimes I feel like it was a lifetime ago. Sometimes I feel like it was yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, so much I can tell you because, we experienced quite a lot on the side where I was, and of course with those who are going through it. But I capture it in the sense of I had spoken at Lexington Lodge one time, and one of the brothers saw me after the pandemic, and he says, "You remember what you said to us? It was like 3 years before 2018 or something. Like you had come by and I remember we asked you like, what was it when we found out what you did? What was it that kept you up at night?" And I said, "What did I say?" He goes, "You said a pandemic." I'm like, yeah, I got to stop telling the truth, because behold, that's exactly what we knew we were planning, that bird flu and other things were there, but just nothing to the extent of what we experienced. And
Sure.
and
Yeah.
that continue to experience, even, we're not out of the woods for everything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot. And I think as Masons, we try to avoid politics, but I hate that particular thing got politicized on either side of the aisle. It really took away some of the stuff that was going on. So I appreciate that you're on our team, and our team meaning human beings. So I appreciate that you're on our team, my friend.
The one thing I could say, tying in Freemasonry, if I can for a bit, because I know you're going to transition. Um, when I became a Mason, it took brothers in my mother lodge 2 years for them to drum up the courage to ask me what it was I actually did, because they didn't understand what an epidemiologist was. But now, fast forward, pandemic and everything else, everybody knows what epidemiology is. So
Yeah. All of a sudden, you got some real credibility. You're like, oh, that's what he went to school for.
yeah, well, it helps because before they usually think, oh, dermatology, and they drop the
Hey,
pencil.
I
Hey,
got this spot on my skin. What do I need to do?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like pull your pants up and go see a doctor for that
Oh
one.
my gosh, that's hilarious. That's hilarious. So you transition a little bit. So give us a high level of your Masonic history. When did you join? Where'd you join? And where are you at today?
So nothing's ever an easy answer, so forgive me. So I joined Freemasonry in 1997. I joined the Grand Lodge of New York in 2009. Um, and my start in 1997 turned out not to be a legitimate start.
Uh-oh, not that we haven't heard that before, boys, on this
Yeah,
podcast.
exactly. So, I've gone on to become one of the leading experts on clandestine masonry in the U.S. and other places. So I've, given a lot of education and supported others in understanding that. But I joined Grand Lodge in New York in 2009, master of my lodge in 2014. Was elected as junior grand warden for the Grand Lodge New York in 2018, 19. 2021. Yep. And my term was usually we do a 2-year term, but obviously with the pandemic, it ended up being 3 years. So now I'm past junior grand warden of the Grand Lodge of New York, and you know, in charge of a number of other, or in leadership in a number of other bodies that exist across Freemasonry. Just
Right.
too many to list, but just a little bit overactive, as most folks would understand.
Yeah. Um, it's nice that you've been able to find a balance with communicating to the world, like if a pandemic would hit, and to being able to be a servant leader. It's sometimes it's a struggle, and I feel like in your vocation and in masonry, both have parallels, right?
Most certainly.
And so the transition's a lot smoother than somebody that may, where I'm from, they may go and build planes all day and then they come. It's quite a different thing where your flow is always that servant leadership. But the other side of it is sometimes the break in the monotony would be nice. So I just wonder how much does that just, is it constantly just like, oh my gosh, I'm constantly serving. What about me, right?
Well, I think it's I usually tell people, seeing what I see and knowing what I, been engaged in, oftentimes it's like you come to masonry as a way to escape
Yep.
all of that because it's just a lot.
Right.
And it's one of those things where, and given whatever one's vocation may be, those things tend to have some degree of truths depending on the individual. But that is actually one of the things which I have so many worlds that I try not to collide. But I remember two instances where my Masonic world and my vocational world collided. So I was in India. It was in Indiana, visiting the local health department, which I worked with for several years, et cetera. And I'm walking into the building of this health department in rural Indiana. And I'm looking at the building. I'm like, this is a lodge building. And I'm like, yeah, that's a lot. I could see. So I asked the health director there, he's good friends. He goes, I said, what was this building before that? He goes, oh, I think we got it from some fraternal group. I was like, the Masons. Yeah. How'd you know? It's like, because I can see all of the
The
artifacts,
stuff that's
etc.
engraved in the stone.
And I go inside and it's like, the environmental health group and, everything that you know from your work. You're like, okay, this makes sense. But you're seeing it now in building structure that's Masonic. And you're like, okay, this had to be the lodge room, which is now like the clinic, so it's just so interesting that I was like, oh, my world
So
collided.
your mind is just firing everywhere. It's like,
Totally like, yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy. So you travel and you give speeches on a lot of topics around there. And the thing that I really wanted to talk about and that you're going to talk about with our listeners today is really the early history of Prince Hall. With the 250-year anniversary approaching Prince Hall, it's a very timely thing. So before you jump into this, I have to ask you, we're from the Midwest, and I have to ask you the biggest rumor we always hear about Prince Hall, and you have the smirk because I know you know what's coming. So let me tell the listeners the silly ass rumor that I've heard, and you tell me how right we are or how off base we are. So, listeners, come with me. Here's the rumor that we've heard in the Midwest. From the conspiracies, I feel like I need my full hat, but pretend like my full hat's on. Men, the Boston Tea Party is not what you think it was. The Boston Tea Party, here's what happened. The King of England was sending a charter over for a Prince Hall Lodge to start, right? The first African lodge to start. And you know what? Our founding fathers, they didn't want any of that smoke. So they came out and they busted open all of these crates and they're looking for the charter so they can burn it and get rid of it. And then they mask it as the Boston Tea Party. They mask it as taxes, but nope, they were going after our Prince Hall brothers. So, Brother Oscar, are we right or are we wrong?
Oh, you're dead wrong.
Oh. So let me ask you, have you heard this rumor?
Yes, I've heard this and other ridiculous things. And I understand why people say these things, because to the extent it tells a story, right? It gives you that social uplift, like, hey, but it's not, it's all false. All right.
So give us the receipts for it. Is it something real simple, like, I don't know, dates?
Yes. Boston Tea Party, in case you don't know, and to give folks time to Google it, December 16th, 1773.
1773.
December 16th, 1773.
Okay.
Right? That was the date of the Boston Tea Party. Prince Hall did not write for his charter until 1784. That charter was actually granted by the Premier Grand Lodge of England to those brothers September 29th, 1784. Now, given the fact that they didn't have Western Union or Zelle, it took a long time for them to get the monies back and forth to pay for the war, the charter, et cetera. So the charter did not arrive to Boston until 1787. So, just playing the game of numbers, Boston Tea Party 1773. He only writes in 1784 to receive the charter, which is given like a month or a couple of months afterwards, but it doesn't arrive until 1787. There's no way on Earl Grey's name that the Boston Tea Party was done in an effort to find and locate the charter and get rid of the charter that England was sending over to Prince Hall.
As a scientist, how dare you bring data into this argument, sir? How dare you?
I can't help it. It's my...
Oh, my gosh. All right, so push that to the side. We want to have a little bit of fun, but that is a rumor, boys. I know a lot of the listeners, they've heard that rumor, so now it's kaput. You've got some information. Shut that crap down, boys. So, Brother Oscar, tell us about the early history of Prince Hall. You have the floor, my friend. I'll sit back and be intrigued.
Sure. And I know this is a little bit different than what you normally have in your podcast, right? So we're just going to rock out, and I'll just throw a couple of things just as a...
Do you, man? Let's do it.
So when you think about early Freemasonry and men of color Freemasonry, oftentimes people would say, another rumor, that Prince Hall was the first man of color ever made a Freemason. That's not entirely true. We know that in the early 1700s or late 1700s, I should say, men of color were made Freemasons in a number of the French islands, for example. You found like Louis Yaya was made a fellowcraft in the island of Guadeloupe. You have this other brother named Michel Cabroli, who was born in Trinidad, and he was made an entered apprentice. Philip Larousse was made a fellowcraft. In fact, we know that there are about 9 free men of color listed in 3 lodges going upwards between 1778 to 1782. Now, you would say, well, that kind of still, we're going to get to it, because one of the things we know that other men of color were also Freemasons in Europe, for example, Angelo Solomon, roughly around 1781, and Joseph Boulogne, which we believe it's around 1773, maybe the earliest date that we have of a person of color being made a Freemason. And Joseph Boulogne, if you've never watched the movie Chevalier, I've actually been speaking about him way before that movie. He was a tremendous aficionado of music. And he, if I can give you one tidbit, if you think about the fencing mask that when you see the Olympic Games of fencing, Joseph Boulogne was the one who helped to create that with his fencing teacher, because he was a master fencer in France and the top fencer in Europe for a period of time. There are others, right? But I'm just going to go into a quick, just bear with me. Let's work with the attention for a minute. Just look at the
sure, yeah, fly.
You understand, right? So if you look at the Americas between the mid to late 1700s, the American colonists, right, began a war of words and resistance. They were fighting against taxation and the British colonial government. And soon you saw that the language that they were using was actually being adopted and integrated by people of color who were fighting for their own personal freedom. So the poems and the letters and the petitions actually reflected the same concept of their appeal for the end of slavery's abolition. So you still had this concept, however, that you have freedom, but you have freedom. What do I mean by that? We know that, white colonists, which publicly talked about, we need to have liberty, we need to have freedom from the king. At the same token, there was still acceptance of slavery, right? In one of the...
We don't want to be oppressed, but we're okay with oppressing.
Totally. Right. So it's when you look at some of the commentary, right? Just you got to challenge the logic of how can you enslave people just on their physical attributes and think that that is okay? It's not okay. While at the same token, you're out there, beating the drums to say, "Hey, we want freedom. We want to be free." Now, the irony in all of this, when you think about the active participation of people of color in America's freedom fight, the first person who died in one of the major conflicts was a man of color. Crispus Attucks in 1770 was the first man to fall in that struggle with the British, where he was shot and killed by a number of British soldiers, and he was a tradesman and essentially is seen and canonized as being, if you look at even what several of the newspapers had done, they mentioned Crispus Attucks was one of the ones that had died early out. Now, all of that being said, just bear with me from history.
Yeah.
There still was a slow road to emancipation in our early country, right?
Sure.
Vermont abolished slavery. Pennsylvania did in 1770, but in actuality, true freedom didn't really hit up until the 1800s. And they all did the same thing. But in the Boston region, in the Northeast, people of color in particular wrote more abolitionist petitions to their state than anywhere else. We even found in 1770 a man of color, actually a person of African descent, basically filed suit for his freedom and won against his former enslaver. And we see that others petition the legislature and even writ, over several, even fought criminal cases. There is just a whole history of people taken to the courts or to the court of public opinion to appeal for this end of this oppression. Now, where does this all play into? When you think about Prince Hall, and those of you who are asking for this kind of an early understanding of primer Prince Hall Masonry, Prince Hall is, and Prince Hall affiliated, is what we consider to be the official recognized body. It is, if anyone talks about Prince Hall Freemasonry, they're speaking specifically to, or at least on our regular world, within Prince Hall affiliated. Yep. Now, he was born in around 1738, and he is known as the father of Black Masonry. He was very very prominent for being a proponent for equal treatment for Blacks, education of children, and of course, the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. Now, he was also a military man. We know that because we have the receipts, right? We see that he not only was commissioned, he had enlisted as a private in the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, and we know this because he also had a bill of sale for some drumheads that he basically had prepared for yet one of the colonial officers to that time. Now, all that being said, here's another little bit of history that becomes touch and go. The legend says that Prince Hall and his other brothers, the 14 other men who started that first lodge in Boston, the legend says 1775. And it's purposely placed that way because it makes you predate the American independence. So one would see in some of the messaging that Prince Hall existed and the organization existed before our government, but that's not true. In actuality, the date that this occurred was March 6, 1778. Not that there's anything wrong with but the facts show it wasn't 1775, it's 1778, because he and the others were initiated by a gentleman by the name of Sergeant John Batt, who was a member of Lodge 441, which was a military lodge under the Irish Constitution that was embedded with the British Army and stationed with the 38th Regiment of Foot in Castle William in Boston. Now, why do I say all of this? Just follow the dots for a minute. Boston is in the middle. That's the orange square in the middle.
Yep.
They were there in the mid 1700s. They evacuated the city after the Bunker Hill and all the battles there. Mm-hmm. And that regiment relocates from Boston to Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. 1775, they're already gone. Right? Mm-hmm. And we see they left, and actually John Batt, who is part of that particular regiment, he gets discharged in Nova Scotia. The regiment leaves Nova Scotia and goes to Staten Island, Brooklyn, or Staten Island, right across, you say, from Brooklyn and Queens. It's one of our boroughs, but Staten Island, New York. Now, the interesting thing about this is they left without John Batt. We know this because Lodge 441 was one of the early military lodges that combined with about 20 plus other lodges to form the first provincial Grand Lodge of New York in New York City. And 441 members were actually Grand Lodge officers. One was a senior Grand Warden, one was the Grand Pursuivant that were 441. So we know that they were not in Boston after 1775. Now, why is this interesting? Because we actually find John Batt, after he has left Nova Scotia, he ends up back in Boston. Because March 6, 1778, not only he is enlisted with, now he switched sides. He has left the British Army, and now he's basically saddled up with the colonialists to fight on their behalf. So now he's pro our side, for lack of a better word. But he initiates these 15 men into Freemasonry on his own. Now, why is that important? Because the legend says that, they were given a grant of a permit by the provincial Grand Master John Rowe at the time. They enjoyed their privileges, and we see in their records, they function as a lodge. They had dues. They expel people for non-payment of dues. They initiated, they raised money to bury their dead. They did all of these things as a full functional lodge. Now, what also transpired, coupled brothers who were in the, I would say, the maritime industry, which was the most popular at that time, they ended up in London, and they found themselves actually in a little bit of a pickle. So they needed help, they needed support. The chances had it that they interacted with some brothers from a lodge called the Lodge of Brotherly Love, number 55, and they met the master of that lodge called William Moody. William Moody essentially, and others test them to make sure and gives them help, gives them aid, supports them. They go back and they write back to Prince Hall and said, hey, we found ourselves in a pickle in London. these brothers treated us as brothers and as men. They helped us out. And Prince Hall was like, what? And he established a direct link to Willie Moody and starts basically developing a friendship, a pen pal, or as we would say nowadays, or I would say they became Facebook friends, right? So they essentially started connecting. And Willie Moody says, when he's telling him all the stuff he's doing in his lodge, he goes, well, why don't you come to the source, which is the Brits, and send us we'll get you a charter. Forget what's going on there in Boston and these other guys aren't going to, they're not giving you any attention, et cetera. So Prince Hall writes, and this is the actual letter that he writes in 1784. It's in the museum in London, and they pulled it out so I can take a look at it and snap the shot. But he writes this charter basically to Willie Moody saying, please, on our behalf, go to the Grand Lodge of England and help us fix this. And 1784, going back to earlier, that's when the charter was given. The charter didn't get there to 1787, but we see that Prince Hall and his lodge members not only got a copy of the constitutions, they got the annual returns, they were sending monies to and dues and remittances back to the Grand Lodge. They were telling them what was going on in Boston as what was happening at that period of time. But we also know that a lot of this connection kind of got dropped, especially when the French wars happened between the U.S. and in England and all the others and France at that time. So a lot of contact fell apart. Now, they still continued meeting as a lodge, just as other lodges in Boston did the same. So no one's doing anything different. But when the Grand Lodge of England forms, here's another interesting tidbit. The United Grand Lodge of England in 1813 is the unification of the moderns and the ancients, right? What happened, the moderns had a certain number of lodges in London and a whole bunch outside, as did the ancients. The Grand Secretary of one of those jurisdictions essentially said, the ancients just basically said, you know what, I'm just going to focus on the lodges that are inside, the moderns, focus on the ones that are inside London, and we're going to drop everyone else. So administratively, they drop lodge number 459 off the roster, and a couple years later, renumbers them and adds them back. This is interesting because going back to mis and disinformation, a lot of the arguments against Prince Hall over the years has been, oh, they got their charter illegitimately. Oh, the charter, they were dropped off the roll, so they ceased to exist. We know that didn't happen. It was an administrative function, but was used as a way of saying to discredit their existence. But this is their charter. This is an image of their charter. It was damaged in a fire. A lot of their lodge buildings burnt down mysteriously. But that one Grand Master actually had run in, and the story is true, he'd run in the fire to just save, and I think the damage to that edge is a result of that fire, but they've since encased it and kept it basically in a safe deposit box. So this is a sense of pride for all Prince Hall brothers, because it is that DNA evidence that shows that they are no different than any of the other early lodges that came about. So that's something, and a lot of people have written things against them and things for them to that extent, but this is that smoking gun, as they would say.
Exactly right. Yeah, I love how you put that, the DNA evidence. I love it.
Totally it. So Prince Hall, as I said, they were doing their thing in Freemasonry. They were meeting. In fact, in several of their conversations, they got one of the copies of both the Constitution, Anderson Constitutions, one of the editions that was done officially by the Grand Lodge of England. And Prince Hall says, hey, I would be glad if you could help me out with some ritual books and the last Constitution. And Moody writes back and says, hey, I thought I sent it to you, but here, I got you a bound copy. And he also let him know that the Prince of Wales at that time had become.
Oh, he was initiated. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the whole thing. In like 1787, Hall writes back like, hey, I'm so grateful our brothers have gotten this book. We're so gracious. People, even, here's an interesting tidbit. Even other lodges are jealous of our book.
Right.
What'd that tell you? They're communicating with other brothers in Boston. Right?
But envy is also scary.
Yeah, well, it tells you, right? So, he just is so effusive of, showing the work to masters of other lodges, walking the praise and acknowledging that, they are doing what is necessary. Now, the key thing that's important about Prince Hall Freemasonry at that time, going to your conversation earlier about, being that connection from the servant leadership to that of the Masonic leadership side,
Yeah.
right? Civic responsibility was tried and true, ingrained in that group of brothers. Now, there was a revolt in dispossessed farmers and war veterans called Shays' Rebellion. Hall and others actually said, "Hey, we want to help out. We want to go in. Deputize us." And of course, they didn't want to let the black guys go in, so they told them no. They turned them down. But Hall gets frustrated, right in doing all these things, get in the air, but never anything happens. In 1787, he and others, about 30 plus, wrote this extensive petition to the governor, basically saying, look, you took us from Africa, you took us from our country, we're in an unhappy situation, we're asking for equality and freedom, you're not giving it to us, so tell you what, just give us a ship so we can take our families and go back to Africa. Now, nothing ever happened. They never got, that to that extent, but it also shows something that was very important about Prince Hall. He was very astute with respect to current events. He knew what was happening in Haiti, and Haiti was important because it was the first African-led country that had its freedom from slavery, etc. And they'd also interacted. There were brothers who left from Boston to actually go help the early Haitian government get formed in education, etc. We know all of that because that information is there. So fast forward. 1827, African Lodge in Massachusetts becomes independent. Most of the Prince Hall Grand Lodges claim their lineage from that Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Massachusetts. And it's not in 1898, the Grand Lodge of Washington tried to recognize them, but they got pressure because people did not want to deal with the fact of a Black Grand Lodge being recognized in the US, right? For whatever reason. Massachusetts also tried that in 1946 and also got heavy pressure. Connecticut was the first to successfully do so in 1989. And as a result of that, 1994 was the time when the United Grand Lodge of England moved to recognize Prince Hall of Massachusetts as a legitimate Grand Lodge, coming from its own origin. And Scotland and Ireland soon followed quickly with that recognition. And basically, the storyline goes, right? If you look at the history of Freemasonry in the early colonial times, people would say, well, they didn't form with 3 lodges. But the irony is this, there are 3 Grand Lodges in North America that were not formed with 3 lodges, but were formed with 2. And we recognize them. In fact, the Grand Lodge in New Jersey, my neighbors opposite that, the Statue of Liberty there, they were formed by a convention of Master Masons, not even lodges. So by the standards of the wild, wild West of Freemasonry, everyone's doing the same thing. So the argument that they're somewhat different versus the allowances for others doesn't necessarily, right? So unmistakably, their philosophy, their exemplary regularity, they are, recognition has existed. We've seen, we still have a few states where recognition does not exist, but for lack of a better word, most of the Grand Lodges have some form of recognition, even if it's not visitation. There are 3 that actually have full plural membership. Massachusetts, I believe Kansas, if I'm not mistaken, and Connecticut do permit their members to be dual members of the State Grand Lodge and of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge.
Right. So what states right now are just no Prince Hall recognition at all?
West Virginia.
Yep.
South Carolina.
Yep.
Mississippi.
And Louisiana.
Louisiana is light blue because they don't recognize their Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Louisiana, but they do recognize the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Maryland. And that's just because the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Louisiana has been acting a little bit out of pocket. So that's, I wouldn't count Louisiana in that just yet.
Okay. Gotcha.
You got them in the north of them.
Yeah. We've come a long way, right?
Yep. So another interesting thing is that if you ever have to win at Scrabble to say, what was the first Prince Hall Grand Lodge? You would say Massachusetts, right?
Well, who wouldn't say that?
Well, the person who knows the right answer. The answer is not the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which is 1827. Actually, the first independent African Grand Lodge of North America was formed in Pennsylvania on December 27th, 1815. So the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania is the oldest Prince Hall Grand Lodge in the US and the first Prince Hall Grand Lodge, period. But in deference to the fact that African Lodge was the progenitor and African Lodge comes up Boston, they usually just let that go. But in actuality, they are the oldest and the first Prince Hall Grand Lodge if you ever have to win at
All
secret.
right. Well, if I'm going to win on the front end, I want to win on the back end and throw you on your heels a little bit. What's the most recent Grand Lodge, Prince Hall?
The most recent Prince Hall Grand Lodge would be the
in the States, in the United States.
Alaska is the last one.
Okay, well, it makes sense. It's our last state to be formed. All right,
I'm to your point. Across the world, right? You have all these groups that exist. There are 47 Grand Lodges, over 5,000 lodges, and really a sense of pride in Prince Hall Freemasonry. So a lot of that, as I said, that's just the early time when you go through the different elements around civil rights and just even looking at even current history. There's just so much, but just keeping it within the early days is why I just wanted to at least share that with you from the lens of the question you asked.
Yeah, so I love it. So back on that slide that you had, you don't have to put back up. You talked about the 5,000 lodges that were basically formed off of Lodge 459, right?
Yep.
So we talked about sports earlier. I love sports analogies. You talk about a coaching tree. That's a coaching tree. Everyone talks about, you got the San Antonio Spurs coaching tree, and then you go into football with this. That coaching tree pales, doesn't it, my friend?
Yeah, I mean, the history is very rich. I mean, a lot of it is also intertwined with the growth in the African-American community. So, for example, a lot of the early Black churches, the first pastors were men who were in Prince Hall lodges. And as they went and spread there and grew the churches within the African-American community, they also drew lodges alongside. And it's one of those things where I even say, Prince Hall died in 1807, right? And the history that we talk about Prince Hall Freemasonry truly is American Masonic history. It's American history. And it's one of those things that I think it bodes us well to at least have a grasp of it so we understand. Yeah. I mean, I tell people, I am here as a result. I'm not a Prince Hall Mason, even though I'm an honorary member of a few Prince Hall lodges.
Sure.
I wasn't initiated past raised in the Prince Hall Lodge, but I benefit from what he had the gumption to want to accomplish for. I mean, Prince Hall was not a Prince Hall Mason either.
Right.
He was a British Mason.
Right.
He was a Mason under the Grand Lodge of England. So what has really transpired is that opportunity, that proponent for equal access, and the opportunity to benefit both socially and have that contract with the perspective of what Freemasonry brings and engenders is what I can always say any one of us can have pride in being a part of.
Yeah, I love it. So in Kansas, being in the middle of the country, we catch both sides kind of waving in. In 1997, our Grand Master, Jeffrey L. Souter's been on our podcast. He was a past imperial potentate of the shrine. He was the Grand Master that recognized Prince Hall. And go back almost 10 years ago, we did a joint raising in Kansas where I got to be careful here. So at the same time, we did a third degree, a room packed. Prince Hall and Kansas Masonry, they were doing it parallel to each other. So we watched both being raised at the same time. So you've got AF&AM watching Prince Hall watching AF&AM. It was the coolest thing. They made a little medal for it. So everyone that was in attendance, it was one of the coolest things I've ever seen because obviously do guards and sign are different. There's our different modes of recognition. They're all a little bit different, but it was such a cool event to be at. And, we let rumors and folklore take over, but man, we all need to walk in each other's shoes, and it changes a lot of things in the world, right?
Most certainly. And I mean, with the nuances there for us, it's not really that much different when you look at the do guards and signs, right? It's for us, it's like saying you're in Manhattan and you go to the Bronx. Like sometimes people may do things a little bit, but they're not supposed to, but at the same token. So you find, and even with my traveling internationally, just, that spirit at Bonner Freemasonry really makes a big difference. And people do want to learn. I mean, there are guys that I remember meeting in Bordeaux, France, and they were like, "You're Prince Hall Mason?" Like, they were just so excited to meet Prince Hall Mason, because they've heard about the history and of the struggles.
I was the same
Yeah.
when I was a master of the lodge. We did an official visit to a Prince Hall lodge, and we were just like, okay, here we go. We better take our white gloves. I know they're wearing white gloves, and just all the things like, oh, well, they're just like us. What the hell are we doing? It was great.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I tell people, especially going back to earlier when I talked about joining in unrecognized lodges, etc. The beauty that we have in regular Freemasonry in the U.S. is that we have two groups who practice regular Freemasonry.
Yep.
Within our states, and we have the ability to illustrate to the community and to the public and to ourselves, increase our awareness of each other, illustrate why it's beneficial for Freemasonry and why ours is the right. Whatever choice you make, whether it's this one or that one, you have two choices. Either of those choices you can't go wrong with, because it speaks to the benefit of the benefit and the value of regular Freemasonry. And I think that message gets heard a bit more when we actually walk the talk and not just speak from behind the walls.
I agree. So, Oscar, thanks for joining the Old Fashioned Masonic Podcast, my friend. I can't wait to have you back on for other topics.
Love it. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and I hope you had a great time with this conversation.
I appreciate it. Cheers.